Hello, my name is Matthew and I'm from Northumbria University in the UK, and today I'll be presenting two aspects of my PhD thesis. The first, which will be aiming to produce a national scale seagrass map for the Maldives, and the second, which will be considering seagrasses as a nursery habitat for fish and how can we evaluate that as an ecosystem service. So during this presentation, I will firstly introduce what seagrasses are. I'll outline their biology, ecology, and discuss very briefly their value to the environment and to society as well. We'll then consider some of the threats to seagrass beds globally and how some of those threats pertain to the Maldives. I'll then introduce the first work package, which is the production of national scale seagrass maps for the Maldives. I'll introduce the research questions and the reasons that we would want to produce these maps in the first place. We'll then consider some of the methods that we use, and I'll present some initial findings from that work. The second work package that I'll present is looking at the value of seagrass beds as a nursery ground for fishes and looking at how we can quantify this value by doing field surveys. And then finally, I will wrap it all up and point out some key messages and then point towards any future work. So I'll begin by introducing the research background to seagrasses. So seagrasses are the only true plants that have adapted to inhabit fully marine conditions. And across their global distribution, they have a varied range of growth forms and morphologies. The diversity isn't very high in terms of their taxonomy, and there are only about 72 species. And of this, we know there are about 8 that are currently inhabiting the Maldives. Seagrasses have a very similar structure to terrestrial plants. They have an underground root system with rhizome that allows for lateral expansion. They also have a leaf sheath, which protects the new shoot growth, which is often in this long strap-like form, but can also be small leaflets, or could be more round broadleaf type growth forms. So seagrasses have a range of very valuable ecosystem services, which are useful to the environment, to people. They can also mitigate some of the impacts of climate change as well. And in the literature, we've identified around about 29 individual services that are provided by seagrass. And the value of these services per unit area are somewhere in the region of $20,000 to $40,000 US per hectare per year. And there's a particular lot of interest in blue carbon, which is the ability of seagrass sediments to store carbon dioxide for a very long time, which can mitigate atmospheric CO2 rise. Despite their high value, seagrass is actually in decline globally. Since the 1880s, it's estimated that we've lost about 20% of our seagrass habitats globally. And still to this day, we're losing about 1 to 2% of seagrass habitats per year. The main reason for this decline is actually coastal development and hardening of shorelines, but also the reduction in water quality, which can lead to the smothering and decline of the photosynthetic ability of seagrass beds. We're also seeing the effects of climate change on seagrasses as well, due to the increased frequency of storms, which uproot seagrass beds and disturb them, and also from sea level rise and marine heatwave events, which can cause large-scale mortality. We're also seeing in some regions a decline in seagrass due to invasive species as well. And with the loss of seagrass beds comes a loss of the valuable services that they provide locally. So if we consider this figure on the right-hand side, which is from a global study of seagrass area change through time in different regions, we see that the patterns are quite varied, but are one of general decline. And since we're interested in the Maldives, we take a look at this bottom right-hand pane. We see that in the tropical Indo-Pacific, there is a general, quite steady decline in seagrass area through time. But when we look under the hood of this global study, we see that there are actually some quite large gaps in the dataset. So this map shows in green areas of seagrass where we think seagrass habitat should exist. And then we have points in yellow and in black circles, which are individual data points, which were used in the study to plot seagrass change through time. We see there are quite a few large gaps in South America, in East Africa, in the Indo-Pacific, but also in the central Indian Ocean, including the Maldives. So this quite nicely leads us into the rationale behind producing seagrass maps for the Maldives and being able to track the change through time. It would be to fill this data gap in global analysis. So one of the first questions I hope to answer with my PhD is one that is very fundamental to monitoring seagrass, and it is what is the distribution and overall extent of seagrass habitats in the Maldives. We also hope to develop the methods used to produce seagrass maps, and then we can apply these methods to consider how seagrass area has changed through time in the Maldives. So one of the systems that we're utilising is a new development in GIS, which is a Google Earth Engine platform. It's a completely cloud-based platform which allows users to use satellite data and other data sets in their analysis whilst harnessing the processing power of Google servers. And on the Google Earth Engine platform, we undertake a number of pre-processing steps using the satellite data hosted on the cloud. First of all, we load the images that we're interested in from the Maldives. We then composite or average the pixels to remove seasonality and variation in pixel quality through time. We also remove clouds, which would block the sight of seagrass beds, and remove areas of land that we're not interested in. We then apply an atmospheric correction, and then we use training data to run a random forest classifier. So each of these steps, there's the opportunity to make lots of different decisions. So we're quite interested in optimizing each of these steps to produce the best maps possible. And one of the very first decisions that we wanted to get correct was one of when do we get the data to produce the seagrass maps, which is the most representative of what's happening on the ground. We were particularly interested in understanding if seagrass habitat area changed on an annual and consistent basis, which can be considered seasonal. So we ran a small pilot study and we considered 7 sites across the Maldives, and we ran a number of seagrass classifications on these sites in different monthly bins of 2 months at a time. And if we consider the first figure on the left hand side, the bar chart, we can see that from 2016 to 2020 there's no consistent pattern in seagrass area change. And if we consider the figure on the right hand side, which is looking at seagrass area across different years but binned into the months, we see that across the years there is some pattern of a decrease in September and October, but our other analysis showed that this was driven mostly by decrease in classification accuracy, which is likely an artifact, an interference from atmospheric changes. So overall, we could be confident that there's no strong seasonal pattern in seagrass area, and that we can go ahead and choose pixels or images that are averaged across a full year. And the second decision that we wanted to get correct was one of choosing the best classifier to use and the appropriate number of training pixels to put into that classifier. So Google Earth Engine allows you to use quite a few different machine learning classifiers. So the first being CART, RF, meaning random forest, and SVM, which is support vector machines. And we wanted to choose the best one to get the best quality maps in this case. So similarly, we ran a number of pilot studies which plotted the accuracy of the maps over a number of different training pixels. You can also add a different number of parameters to each of the training machine learning classifiers, and we did this and plotted the most accurate. From this analysis, we showed that a support vector machine was the most efficient and the most accurate at the lowest number of training pixels. So the initial results from this seagrass mapping work have shown a high prevalence of seagrass beds, particularly in the south around inhabited islands. The mapping accuracy is generally very high, it's around 92%. And if we look at the figure on the right hand side from Lamu Atoll, we can see that the classifier is doing quite a good job at characterising the distribution and extent of seagrass beds in this region. And so this represents the kind of level of detail that we'll be able to achieve across the national level. So the next steps for this work will be to continue to develop the methods, and I plan to go to Berlin in Germany sometime this year to continue to work with collaborators at the Aerospace Centre there to develop the methods and the coding that we've used to produce these maps. Then we will characterise the seagrass extent over a national scale and apply these methods to track seagrass area change through time and get a better understanding of the health and trajectories of these seagrass beds in the Maldives. So now we've explored some of the seagrass mapping work that we've been undertaking. I will now move on to look at the seagrass fish diversity and value work and our attempt to quantify the value of ecosystem services provided by Maldivian seagrass beds. So as I mentioned earlier, seagrasses are very valuable and provide a high number of of diverse ecosystem services. One of the most highly valued and appreciated is the ability of seagrass beds to store blue carbon. And there are projects currently that exist in the Maldives which are attempting to quantify the amount of blue carbon stored in seagrass sediments in the Maldives and also come up with some estimates of their value. So this work on fisheries is hopefully going to be complementary to the blue carbon work, and in some cases we can use extra ecosystem services to package up with blue carbon and provide resilience credits for sustainable financing schemes, which do allow us to feed in and to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals, particularly number 14. So for this work, we were particularly interested in which key fisheries species are associated with Maldivian seagrass beds and how these are distributed around different zones. And then we hope to work with the Blue Marine Foundation's economics team to come up with an estimate of the value of the fish that we find living in the beds. So in order to answer these questions, we undertook ecological surveys of 2 seagrass meadows around Hittu, which is an inhabited island on Vasile, and Gardu, which is a recently, as of 2016, an uninhabited island. We obtained permits from the EPA to conduct seine netting surveys and underwater video surveys, and we managed to complete 35 seines and 52 underwater videos across the 2 islands. And we were surveying in different zones, so on Hittu we looked at the oceanward side, the lagoonward side and the channel, and on Gardu we considered the oceanward side and the lagoonward side. So the seine net surveys were conducted over a 30-metre transect, and these allowed us to sample small and cryptic species within the seagrass bed. We also used remote underwater videos to survey the large, more mobile species which could be missed by the seine nets due to their highly mobile nature. The initial results show a high number of fish species inhabiting Maldivian seagrass beds. So the data I present here is just from the first 6 seine nets that I have processed, and on average we caught around about 195 fish per seine, but up to 303. As you can see from the image down the bottom, there's a high diversity of different types of species inhabiting different niches. And the fish sampled from this method are generally quite small, so around 40 millimeters in length was the average, and the frequency distribution shows a positive skew from all the species that we caught, showing a high prevalence of smaller individuals and less prevalent with the larger individuals. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is only data from the first 6 seines, so the next steps are to continue to process these data and begin to characterize the different community composition across different zones. We'll then look at identifying key fisheries target species and species with other valuable ecosystem services, and we'll work with the Blue Economics team to develop a method for quantifying their value to fisheries and to other ecosystem services as well. So now that I've discussed the 2 work packages, I'll quickly summarize some take-home messages and directions for future work. The general context of this work is that seagrass is very valuable, but is declining globally, and that in particular we have a big data gap in the Maldives that needs to be filled. We hope that the seagrass mapping work will provide high-resolution data that can be used both for monitoring and for planning of conservation, and the analysis of change through time will give us a better idea of the state of Maldivian seagrass beds and the future trajectories of those beds as well. The work on fish diversity and value will provide some very detailed information on the types of species that utilise seagrass beds in the Maldives, and the economic estimates will allow us to come up with value of the ecosystem service provided by seagrass beds in terms of fisheries provision, which may aid in conservation planning and decision making as well. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you a lot for your time, and hopefully this work was interesting to you. If you would like to chat further, or if you have any questions, unfortunately I can't be there today in person, but you can contact me on my email address, which is m.floyd@northumbria.ac.uk, or on Twitter. I'd also like to say thank you to all of our collaborators and those that helped us in the field as well. Thank you.